My name is Rachel Morgan, and I'm 38 years old. I had been married to Jason for 11 years, and that afternoon, I was standing beside him and our 16-year-old daughter, Chloe, at the coming-of-age ceremony our family had spent weeks preparing for. I thought the hardest part of the day would be watching my daughter step into a new stage of her life. I was wrong. The argument started when my sister-in-law, Rebecca, made a comment about money and the Morgan family. I told her she was crossing a line, but before I could say anything more, my father-in-law, William, stepped between us. His face hardened. Enough. Everyone around us went quiet. Then he looked directly at me. "You're a gold digger." I stared at him, barely believing he had said it in front of Chloe. William pointed toward the door. "My son deserves better than this. Get out." For a second, I looked at Jason, expecting him to defend me against his father. Instead, he reached for my hand. "We're leaving." He didn't argue with William. He didn't ask me to stay and smooth things over. He simply took my hand, and we walked out together while the celebration continued behind us. I thought we were leaving an ugly family argument behind. I had no idea that 2 hours later, William would call Jason in a panic and say something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about that family. "Tell your wife not to sign anything until we talk. Before we go any further, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. I want to know how far we can travel together with this story." By late afternoon, I was driving toward the edge of town with no clear idea what I was going to do next. I wasn't looking for another job, at least not yet. I needed somewhere quiet enough to think, and there was only one person I trusted to let me do that without telling me what I should feel. My Aunt Colleen lived 20 minutes away, so I turned onto the road leading to her house and called her from the car. She answered on the second ring. "Caleb? I need to talk to you." She heard something in my voice and didn't ask for details over the phone. "Come over." When I arrived, I told her exactly what had happened at the bakery. I didn't ask her for money, a job, or a favor. I simply told her that Trevor had told me to leave and that my parents had stood there and let him do it. Colleen listened without interrupting. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Do you still want to bake?" "Yes," she nodded once. "Then come with me." A few minutes later, we were driving toward a small industrial property on the older side of town. Colleen stopped in front of a building I had never seen before. She unlocked the side door and switched on the lights. "This used to be mine," she said. The bakery had been closed for years. Dust covered the counters, the storage shelves were nearly empty, and several machines looked as if they had not moved since the doors were shut. I didn't stand there imagining what it could become. I started checking what was actually there. The oven still had a solid frame, but its controls needed work. The mixer turned, although it made a rough grinding sound. I checked the electrical panel, outlets, breakers, and the main lines running into the production area. The storage room was dry, but needed cleaning. The stainless steel work tables were scratched but usable. I inspected the doors, locks, ceiling, and roofline for leaks or structural problems. Then I found the old licensing paperwork in a cabinet near the office. Some permits were expired. Others would need to be renewed before I could legally produce and sell food from the building. I photographed the serial numbers on the equipment, wrote down the repairs, and checked the water lines beneath the sinks. One faucet leaked, 2 outlets were dead, and the back door did not close tightly enough to keep the cold air from coming through. None of it was impossible, but none of it was free. Colleen watched me go through everything. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad enough that nobody should start tomorrow." She smiled. "Good." I looked at her. "That means you can start today." She wasn't offering to rebuild the place for me. She wasn't handing me a check. She told me the property was available for me to use while I figured out whether I could make it work, and she gave me time to prove it to myself. I spent the next several days doing one job at a time. I cleared out broken boxes, scrubbed the storage area, cleaned the work tables, and tested every piece of equipment that could still be salvaged. I replaced small electrical parts, called a technician about the mixer, and made a list of everything the oven needed. I also contacted the county office about the permits and scheduled the inspections I would need before opening. Until those were cleared, I couldn't sell anything, no matter how ready the bakery looked. I spent my remaining savings carefully. Flour came first, then yeast, butter, sugar, eggs, packaging, and the basic ingredients I could afford. I compared prices at 3 suppliers before placing the first orders because every dollar had to have a purpose. I didn't hire a full crew. For now, it was just me. That meant I had to learn which tasks could wait and which ones could not. I cleaned in the morning, handled repairs in the afternoon, and worked through recipes at night. When something went wrong, there was nobody else to blame and nobody else to fix it for me. I kept a notebook beside the register and recorded every decision, expense, and adjustment. I wrote down the cost of every batch, calculated how many loaves I needed to sell to cover expenses, and built a production schedule around what one person could realistically handle. I wasn't trying to recreate the bakery I had left behind. I was building something small enough to control and strong enough to grow. Colleen stopped by once each evening. She never took over. She asked questions, checked the work, and left me to make the decisions. On the 7th morning, I unlocked the front door before sunrise. The bakery was still quiet. The mixer sat against the wall, the work tables were clean, and the ingredients were lined up where I had decided they belonged. For the first time, the empty room felt ready for work. I stood there for a moment, then walked to the old oven and rested my hand against the worn control panel for a second. I turned the switch. The oven clicked. Then the burner came alive. The next morning, I started before sunrise. I measured the flour twice, checked the water temperature, and followed the formula I had written down the night before. The old oven heated unevenly, but I thought I could compensate for it. I was wrong. The first loaves came out pale on one side and too dark on the other, with a dense center that never developed the texture I wanted. I cut one open, tasted it, and put the rest aside. None of them were good enough to sell. I had spent money on ingredients, packaging, and repairs, and now the first batch was sitting on a rack that I couldn't use. I didn't throw everything away immediately. I weighed the loaves, checked the internal temperature, and wrote down what had gone wrong. The oven was part of the problem, but the dough was too wet for the conditions inside the shop, and my proofing time had been too short. I changed the formula and tried again the following day. The second batch looked better. The crust was more even, the shape held, and the center had a much lighter texture. I still wouldn't have put them in a customer's hands. The flavor needed more balance, and the loaves dried faster than they should have. Instead of guessing, I began treating each batch like a test. I recorded the amount of flour, water, yeast, salt, and fat in every mix. I tracked room temperature and dough temperature, then compared the results after different proofing times. I tested how long the loaves could cool before being packaged, and which bags kept the crust from becoming soft. I also learned that a recipe that worked at 6 in the morning did not always behave the same way at noon. The small differences mattered. By the end of the week, I had a spreadsheet filled with measurements and notes, and I finally had a batch I was willing to put in front of someone who might actually buy it. My first opportunity came from a small neighborhood grocery store about 15 minutes from the bakery. The owner, Mrs. Harris, agreed to try a limited delivery after tasting 2 loaves I brought in. She didn't want a large order. She didn't even want a standing arrangement. "Bring me 12 on Friday," she said. "If they sell, we'll talk." I delivered 12 loaves in plain bags with simple labels. I checked the shelf twice before leaving, then forced myself to drive away instead of hovering around the store. By early afternoon, Mrs. Harris called. She had sold most of them. A few customers had asked when the next delivery would arrive. I brought 24 the following week. This time, they were gone before closing. The next order was 36, then 48. The numbers were still small, but they were real, and every increase came with a practical problem. I needed more flour, more packaging, more reliable production times, and a better way to move finished loaves from the cooling racks to the delivery boxes. I was still doing almost everything myself, so every new order took time away from something else. One Thursday morning, while I was loading boxes for another delivery, a man in a gray jacket stopped beside the van. He introduced himself as Graham Ellis, a buyer and distributor who handled purchasing for a small regional group of grocery stores and cafes. He had heard about my bread from Mrs. Harris and wanted to try it himself. I handed him 2 loaves. He inspected the labels, asked about ingredients, then tasted a slice. He didn't compliment me right away. Instead, he asked a much more useful question. "How much can you make in a week?" I gave him the number I could produce without risking quality. Graham looked at the delivery boxes and then back at me. That's not much. It's what I can make right now. He nodded. If the stores like it, I could need several times that. I understood immediately what he was offering. It wasn't another small order. It was a chance to put my bread into multiple stores at once. It was also more than my bakery could handle. I went back inside and looked at the equipment, the work tables, and the production schedule I had built around one person. The numbers didn't work. I could stay small and protect what I had built, or I could put almost all the money I had left into increasing capacity before I knew whether the larger orders would continue. That night, I went through every expense again, calculated the cost of another mixer, additional refrigeration, larger ingredient orders, packaging, and the repairs needed to keep the old oven running reliably. I didn't make the decision because I was certain it would work. I made it because staying where I was would guarantee that I could never find out. The next morning, I placed the first equipment order. I knew it would leave very little room in my budget, so I prioritized anything that could increase output without sacrificing consistency. I called the supplier, confirmed the delivery date, and then rearranged the production schedule around the equipment I was about to receive. There was no guarantee Graham would place another order, but for the first time, the decision in front of me was no longer whether I could bake. It was whether I was ready to build a bakery that could keep up. The following week, I stopped measuring the bakery by how much I could produce alone. I started measuring it by how much the business could handle without falling apart. The first equipment deliveries arrived one at a time, and I reorganized the production floor around them. The new mixer cut preparation time, the additional refrigeration gave me room to hold ingredients safely, and a second work surface allowed 2 tasks to happen at once. I hired 2 employees, both with food service experience, and spent the first few mornings teaching them the recipes, sanitation procedures, portion sizes, and packing standards I had developed. I didn't want the bread to change depending on who was working that day. Every loaf needed to come out with the same weight, texture, crust, and appearance. Graham became more involved as the orders grew. We finalized our first distribution agreement, and his network began placing regular orders instead of occasional test deliveries. I built a production schedule that separated mixing, proofing, baking, cooling, packing, and loading into specific time blocks. It wasn't complicated, but it gave everyone a clear job and kept small delays from turning into missed deliveries. I also worked with a local printer to create proper packaging. The bags carried the bakery name, ingredient information, weight, contact details, and a simple label that could be recognized on a store shelf. Until then, I had been selling bread. Now I was building a product. I registered the brand and began standardizing every recipe. Instead of keeping measurements in my notebook as rough notes, I converted them into exact formulas that could be followed by someone else. We recorded batch yields, ingredient costs, waste, labor time, and delivery expenses. That changed the way I looked at every order. A larger sale meant nothing if the margin disappeared after production and transportation. I created reorder points for flour, yeast, butter, sugar, packaging, and cleaning supplies, then assigned inventory checks to the end of each production day. My employees also began recording damaged packages and unsold returns, which gave me numbers I could use rather than guesses based on what the shelves looked like. Within a few months, the old bakery started feeling smaller. Finished products were stacked wherever we had room, ingredient deliveries crowded the storage area, and the loading space became difficult to manage. I rented a nearby warehouse for dry ingredients, packaging materials, and backup supplies. That freed the bakery for production and gave us enough room to work without constantly moving things around. I also arranged regular pickup times with suppliers so deliveries would arrive when someone was available to receive them instead of interrupting the morning production cycle. My family remained distant. Trevor still believed I had failed, and Martin and Denise rarely called. I didn't correct them. I wasn't interested in sending photographs, showing invoices, or explaining what the bakery was becoming. I had already spent enough time trying to prove that my work mattered. Now I had customers who were proving it for me. Then Graham called with a proposal that changed the scale of the business. A larger regional retail group was interested in carrying our products across several locations. The opportunity was far bigger than anything we had handled before, but accepting it meant I had to turn the bakery into a real company. Graham sent me the projected order volumes, delivery requirements, product specifications, and payment terms. I spent an entire evening reviewing the numbers before agreeing to move forward. I met with an accountant and separated the business finances from my personal accounts. I formed the company, opened dedicated banking, established bookkeeping procedures, purchased commercial insurance, and reviewed the legal requirements for a long-term supply agreement. The production line also needed another upgrade. I approved the purchase because the new volume would be impossible to manage with our current setup. We added equipment that reduced manual handling, improved consistency, and gave the employees enough capacity to complete larger batches without extending the workday indefinitely. The work became more structured. My employees knew their responsibilities, Graham had predictable delivery windows, and I could finally see where the money was going. We weren't simply making more bread. We were building a system that could support a larger operation. I began reviewing weekly sales, production costs, inventory, labor, and delivery expenses every Friday. If something was inefficient, I changed it before it became expensive. If an order was too large for our schedule, I renegotiated the delivery date instead of promising something we couldn't fulfill. The decisions were no longer about whether I could finish another batch before midnight. They were about whether the company could keep its promises. I checked the second page, then the third. The company name was correct, the delivery schedule matched the numbers Graham had given me, and the product list included several of our best-selling loaves. There was no mistake in the paperwork. The signature line was waiting for him. A few weeks later, Graham sent over the new distribution contract. I opened the file at my desk and scanned the first page. The partner company had already assigned its authorized representative. I stopped when I saw the name, Trevor. He was about to sign a contract for a brand he still believed had nothing to do with me. By the time the new distribution agreement was finalized, Trevor had already started looking for products that could give his food distribution business a stronger position with regional retailers. He was no longer working around the bakery where I had spent years. He was building a network of grocery stores, cafes, and independent markets that needed products customers would buy repeatedly. My bread reached him through one of those accounts, without either of us knowing how close the connection really was. The first report from his purchasing team showed something interesting. The sales data was unusually consistent across different locations, which made the product more attractive to a distributor like Trevor. It wasn't dependent on one store or one neighborhood. The demand was spreading naturally. Stores were reordering before their shelves stayed empty for long, and customers were coming back for the same loaves instead of treating them as a one-time purchase. The margins were healthy enough for Trevor to take notice. He asked his team to find out who made the product, how much more could be supplied, and whether the brand could support a larger rollout. He received the answer through the distribution paperwork. The company name was mine. Trevor still didn't recognize it as connected to me. My name wasn't presented to him as the person behind the bakery, and nothing in the sales process required him to make that connection. From his perspective, he had simply found a promising brand with room to grow. A few days later, his company submitted its first substantial order. My operations manager brought the numbers to me during our morning meeting. I read the purchase order carefully, then looked at the distributor listed near the top, Trevor's company. For several seconds, I said nothing. I could have asked Graham to reject the order. I could have told our accounting team to remove Trevor's company from the approved distributor list. I could have called Trevor myself and asked whether he had any idea whose bread he was selling. I did none of those things. Keep the contract, I said. My operations manager looked at me, waiting for an explanation. I gave him one instruction instead. Treat them like every other account. Same pricing, same delivery standards, same payment terms. That was important to me. I wasn't going to manipulate the business just because the distributor happened to be my brother. If Trevor wanted the product, he would receive it under the same conditions as everyone else. The difference was that I now had a front row seat to what happened when he built his business around something he didn't realize I owned. Trevor increased his orders quickly. He added our bread to more locations, negotiated larger shelf placements, and began promoting the brand through his sales network. His representatives started presenting the product to new buyers because the numbers made their pitch easy. Stores liked the repeat sales, and Trevor liked the margin. Our weekly reports reflected the change. One account that had started as a normal distributor relationship was becoming one of the strongest channels in our sales network. I watched the numbers without contacting him. Then I heard about Trevor at home through people who still spoke to my parents. Martin and Denise were proud of him. They told relatives that Trevor had found his place in the food business and was building something successful. They talked about his growing distribution network and the new accounts he had brought in. Not once did anyone mention me. I didn't correct them. Trevor had spent years believing I had failed after leaving the family bakery. I had no interest in changing that story before the business required him to know the truth. Instead, I focused on what his orders were doing to our company. His growth pushed our production higher, which meant better utilization of our equipment, more predictable purchasing, and stronger relationships with retailers. The account that could have been awkward became financially useful because I refused to make it personal. By the end of the quarter, Trevor's company had expanded into several additional stores. He increased his purchase volume again and asked Graham whether we could reserve more production capacity for his accounts. Graham brought the request to me. I approved it. The irony was almost too clean. Trevor wasn't merely selling a product I had created, he was building part of his distribution business around it. A month later, our finance team prepared the quarterly performance report. Revenue had climbed sharply, and the brand's growth was beginning to attract attention outside Graham's network. During a review meeting, one of my managers placed another document beside the sales report. This came in this morning. I opened it. It was an inquiry from a major food company asking whether I would consider discussing an acquisition. I read the letter twice. They weren't asking for a sales meeting. They wanted to discuss buying the company behind the brand. I closed the folder and looked across the table at my team. We had started with a closed bakery, a handful of ingredients, and a decision to take one more chance. Now a major corporation wanted to know what my company was worth, and Trevor was still selling my bread without knowing who owned it. 7 years passed. The bakery was no longer a small operation inside an aging building on the edge of town. It had become a modern production facility with separate areas for mixing, baking, cooling, packaging, storage, and shipping. What once depended on my hands now depended on systems, people, and schedules that could keep the company moving even when I wasn't standing on the production floor. We had a production team responsible for daily output, a sales department managing retail accounts, and distribution partners covering multiple states. The brand had become valuable enough that decisions about another production line could involve more planning than the first bakery ever required. I still walked through the facility every morning, but I no longer checked every machine myself. Managers handled maintenance, supervisors tracked production, and our sales team brought me forecasts instead of individual orders. My job had changed from making bread to deciding where the company could go next. Colleen remained part of that journey. She never asked for recognition, and she never tried to control the business. She simply stayed close enough to know when I needed another perspective. Whenever we talked, she still asked questions that had nothing to do with revenue. She wanted to know whether the employees were treated well, whether I was sleeping enough, and whether I still enjoyed the work. I had never forgotten what she had done for me. She had given me access to a place where I could start again when I had almost nothing left to build with. I never treated that as a small favor. I kept the original bakery key in my office, inside a frame on the wall behind my desk. I didn't need it anymore, but I wanted it there. Trevor had changed too. His distribution company had grown into a substantial regional operation. He had more employees, more retail accounts, and a larger network of food suppliers than he had when he first signed our distribution agreement. A significant portion of that growth had come from the demand for our products. He had built his sales strategy around brands that performed consistently, and ours remained one of his strongest accounts. He made money from distributing my products, expanded his customer base because of them, and still had no idea that I owned the company behind the label. I knew because his company appeared in our partner reports every month. There was no reason to expose the truth early. The business relationship worked. The contracts were being honored, and I had no interest in turning a successful company into a family argument. Martin and Denise occasionally mentioned Trevor when relatives gathered, usually with pride. They talked about his distribution business and the growth he had achieved. They never mentioned my company because, as far as they knew, I was still somewhere in the background of the food industry. I let them believe whatever they wanted. The important part was that the company was no longer dependent on anyone's approval. One Tuesday morning, Graham asked me to come into the executive conference room. He had brought a folder and several pages of financial projections. I sat down across from him while he opened the file. The numbers were different from anything we had discussed before. A major food corporation had been studying our growth, distribution footprint, customer retention, and brand position. They were interested in either acquiring the company or making a strategic investment that would give them a significant stake. Graham slid the valuation analysis across the table. The projected enterprise value was $96 million. I read the number twice. It wasn't a casual estimate based on one strong quarter. It reflected the size of the business we had built, the distribution network, the production capacity, the contracts, and the brand's position in the market. Graham explained that the corporation wanted a meeting with the key people connected to the business before making a formal proposal. That included senior members of our management team, major partners, and distributors whose contracts and relationships were important to the company's future. I asked him for the list. He handed it to me. I recognized several names immediately. Then I reached the distribution section. Trevor's company was listed among the major partners. I looked at the name for a moment before moving to the next page. Graham noticed but didn't comment. "Everyone on this list will receive the meeting schedule today," he said. "They'll be told that the discussion concerns a potential acquisition and strategic investment." I nodded. There was no reason to warn Trevor. The invitation would give him the same information it gave everyone else, and he could decide whether the opportunity mattered to him. Later that afternoon, the meeting coordinator sent the invitations. Trevor received his through the same professional channel as every other partner. He opened the calendar invitation, checked the location, and saw the names of the corporate representatives attending. The agenda described the meeting as a strategic discussion regarding the future of the brand. Trevor accepted without hesitation. He had no reason to suspect anything unusual. To him, it was another business meeting involving a brand that had become increasingly important to his distribution company. He didn't know who owned the company, he didn't know whose signature had built the contracts he depended on, and he certainly didn't know who would be sitting across the table when the meeting began. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Trevor had taken his seat among the other distribution partners, speaking casually with executives he had met through the industry over the years. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. He had arrived prepared to discuss margins, delivery commitments, and the possibility of expanding his role as a distributor. Nothing in the invitation had identified the owner by name. As far as he knew, he was there to discuss the future of a brand his company had helped distribute for years. I entered a few minutes later with Graham and two members of my executive team. Trevor looked toward the door, barely paying attention, until his eyes reached me. He stopped talking. For a moment, neither of us moved. I walked to the front of the room and took the seat reserved for the owner and CEO. Trevor's expression changed when the presentation screen came alive. The first document showed the company name, followed by the brand valuation and proposed transaction structure. He scanned the page quickly, then looked lower. His eyes stopped on the ownership section. Owner, CEO Caleb Morgan. He read it again. Then he looked at me. "What did you do?" The question came out quietly, almost as if he was afraid someone else might hear the answer. "I didn't raise my voice. I built an empire without you." Trevor shook his head. "No, that can't be right." He picked up the document and read the ownership information again. "This company is yours?" "Yes." He looked from the paperwork to me. "You're the owner?" "I'm the owner." His face tightened as he tried to connect 7 years of information that had never seemed related. The products he had been distributing, the orders he had increased, the retailers he had brought into his network, and the company whose growth had strengthened his own business, suddenly had a name he recognized. "Mine." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I let the question sit for a moment. There was no reason to turn the meeting into a speech about the past. "You told me to get out of the factory," I said. "I did." Trevor stared at me. "That was 7 years ago. And I never came back asking you for anything." He looked down at the contract in front of him. "You knew I was distributing your products." "I knew." "For 7 years?" "Yes." His voice rose slightly. "You knew?" "I knew your company was one of our distribution partners. I also knew the contracts were being fulfilled and the business relationship was working." Trevor pushed his chair back a few inches. You let me build my company around your brand without telling me. I kept my voice level. You built your distribution business by selling a product customers wanted. I didn't take that away from you. He looked toward Graham as if expecting him to correct me. Graham remained silent. Trevor turned back to the documents. So I don't own any part of this? No. I don't control the brand? No. Then what am I? I answered plainly. A distributor. The word landed harder than anything I could have said. Trevor had spent years introducing himself as the person who could get our products onto more shelves, and now he was being reminded that distribution was only one part of the company he had helped expand. He had access to the product, but access had never meant ownership. Trevor looked at the sales projections, then at the proposed transaction value. The number was impossible to ignore. The company he had been treating as one of his strongest supplier relationships was now being valued at $96 million. He had made money distributing it, but he had never owned the asset that created the demand. He had never controlled the company, its production, its contracts, or its brand. He had simply stood between the products and the retailers who sold them. Our growth, he said slowly. The new accounts, the expansion. Some of that came from the brand, I said. Your company still did the distribution work. I'm not taking that away from you. Trevor looked at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You could have told me. You could have asked. He had no immediate answer. The room stayed quiet while the acquisition representatives reviewed their notes. I wasn't interested in humiliating him the way he had once humiliated me. The difference was that I no longer needed his approval, his apology, or his recognition. I had built the company without asking whether he believed I could. Trevor looked back at the ownership page. Is this why you kept the contract? Partly. You wanted to watch me sell your own product? No, I wanted the business relationship to remain a business relationship. He rubbed his forehead and looked toward the conference table. My parents know? They know I work in food manufacturing. They don't know everything about the company. Trevor gave a short, disbelieving laugh. So they still think I was the one who made it. I didn't answer immediately. That wasn't my story to tell for them. Graham finally closed the folder in front of him and addressed the room. We have 20 minutes before the next session. We need to keep the transaction discussion on schedule. One of the acquisition representatives nodded and brought up the next slide. It outlined the proposed investment structure, valuation range, governance terms, and the conditions that would need to be negotiated before any agreement could be signed. Trevor slowly pulled his chair back into place. He looked at me once more. But this time there was something different in his expression. He was no longer looking at the brother he had sent away from the factory. He was looking at the person who now controlled the company whose products had become central to his distribution business. I opened the presentation folder in front of me. Let's begin, I said. By the time the acquisition discussions became public, the news had spread far beyond the company. Martin and Denise learned that I was not simply working in food manufacturing. I was the owner and CEO of the company they had never realized I had built. Their call came the following evening. Martin spoke first, and his voice was different from the one I remembered from the factory. There was no criticism, no comparison with Trevor, and no question about whether I had made the right choice. He asked if Denise and he could meet with me. I agreed, but I made the meeting short and private. When they arrived, Denise looked at me for several seconds before speaking. We're still your family. I nodded. You are. She reached for my hand, but I didn't move mine across the table. I wasn't angry. I simply didn't want the conversation to become a shortcut around everything that had happened. Martin said they had been proud of Trevor because they believed he was the one who had built a successful career in food distribution. Then he admitted they had never imagined I would build something on this scale. I told them that wasn't the part that mattered to me. 7 years earlier, when I needed them to stand beside me, they had chosen Trevor. They had watched me leave and never asked where I was going, or whether I was going to be okay. Now they knew my company was worth more than they had ever imagined, but that didn't give them a claim on what I had built. Denise became quiet. Martin apologized, not with excuses this time, but with a simple acknowledgement that they had treated me unfairly. I accepted the apology. I did not promise that everything would return to the way it had been. Some relationships could improve, but they would have to be rebuilt through actions rather than a sudden change in attitude. Trevor asked to meet me 2 days later. He arrived without the confidence he had carried into the conference room. He didn't bring up the factory first. He asked about his distribution company. His contract with my company had become important to his operation, and he wanted to know whether I intended to end it. I told him the answer depended on business performance. If his company continued meeting delivery standards, payment terms, reporting requirements, and customer service expectations, there was no reason to cancel the agreement. If it failed those conditions, I would replace the distributor. Trevor looked at me for a long moment. So this isn't about what happened between us? It can't be, I said. If I run the company based on family arguments, I won't be running a company. He nodded slowly. For the first time, he understood that I wasn't trying to punish him. I was simply no longer willing to let our history decide my business decisions. Before he left, he asked whether I hated him. I told him I didn't. I had spent years building a life that didn't require me to hate anyone. That answer seemed to affect him more than an angry response would have. A week later, I met with Colleen. I brought her to my office and placed a revised ownership proposal in front of her. She looked at the document, then at me. I told her I wanted to give her a meaningful financial interest in the company, not as repayment for a loan, because she had never treated what she gave me as a loan. She had given me access to the old bakery and the freedom to prove myself. The equity was my way of recognizing the role she had played in the beginning. Colleen read the proposal carefully before signing. She didn't celebrate or make a speech. She simply smiled and told me she was glad I had built something that belonged to me. A few weeks later, I drove back to the old bakery alone. The building had changed very little. The old oven was still there, no longer part of my production system, but still standing where I had first tested whether I could start over. I walked inside, ran my hand across the worn control panel, and remembered the morning I had first turned it on. I didn't remember the fear as clearly as I remembered the decision to keep going. 7 years ago, I walked out of my brother's factory with nothing. I never went back for the factory. I built something they could never take from me. Looking back, the greatest lesson wasn't that I became successful after my family rejected me. It was that I stopped measuring my worth by whether they believed in me. Sometimes the people closest to you may recognize your value only after the world does, but their recognition is not what gives your work its value. What matters is what you build when nobody is applauding, what you protect when others try to define your limits, and whether you can succeed without becoming cruel to the people who once hurt you. I didn't need my family to lose for me to win. I needed to become responsible for my own choices, protect what I built, and decide for myself who deserved a place in my future. And that was enough. That is the part I hope people remember. Rejection can close one door, but it does not have to decide where your life goes next. You can walk away without walking backward, build quietly, and let your choices become the answer. You do not have to prove your worth to the people who dismissed you. You only have to keep building until your life reflects the value you already knew you had. For me, that meant choosing purpose over revenge, boundaries over bitterness, and work over the need to be understood.